So while David is being wired up, for those of you who are coming here for the first time, welcome to IIHS. We regularly have these lectures by people from both inside and outside the country. And today we are very happy to have a whole set of colleagues from all over the world who work on risk and disasters and a little bit of climate change. And as part of that process, David Sattertwaite is here. David is a very old friend, but he has a history that predates having met in the 1980s. He's one of the, I mean, at least in my appreciation, he gets embarrassed when I say this, he's one of the world's leading urbanists. Apart from many other things, he was one of the team that sort of led the process of creating the space around human settlements. Because he worked with Barbara Ward, and Barbara and him essentially helped create the 1976 meeting which created UN Habitat. So he was, you know, his engagement with this space goes back quite a while. But apart from that, I think, you know, he's a prolific author, so there are books that come out every 2 years. The latest one is on poverty in the Global South. The next one is a reprise, I think, about how to fix poverty on the Global South. Yeah, that's the next one. So this is probably the 12th or the 14th of the series that he's been writing for multiple decades. But many of us know him as the editor of one of the most accessible and important journals in the space called Environment and Urbanization, which has been around now for a quarter century. And the interesting thing about environment and urbanization and the work that David has done with his colleagues at IID over the many years is that it not only has academics who write for it, but a large number of practitioners. And in some ways, I think, especially because of the connection with movements across the world, the journal has helped redefine practice in many geographies. So it's that connection between practice and theory building and building networks, especially across the Global South, Latin America, Africa, and of course, Asia, and particularly India, where he's been running conversations for at least 30 years or more with people in various parts of the world. So we're very glad to have him here. David and I also have been working together quite intensively over the last 3 years, trying to put together what I hope will be a critical chapter in the new climate change assessment, which comes out next month, the IPCC adaptation chapter, which we've sort of co-led. So there's a connection between climate change, disaster risk, informality, and urban development. And I think he's going to share with us some of the challenges that we've been facing both in this and trying to redefine the new post-2015 Sustainable Development Goal Framework, and especially within that, to insert the ideas that cities are important places within that frame. So this is a partial response not only to discussions in the room and work that we've been doing here at IIHS and other places, but also a response to a lot of people who will hopefully see this streaming on the net, because this battle has been going on for close to 40 years now, and it's not about to close this evening, but at least one more step forward. So thanks a lot, David. All yours.
Thank you, Ari. Thanks for a wonderful introduction. How wonderful to finally visit IIHS. You know, I've been working with you and negotiating papers from you and publishing you and reading your material, but finally to actually come here is really a treat. But I come at the wrong time, because at the moment there's an expert group meeting going on here, led by United Nations, with some of the world's top specialists on this particular topic. And the one thing you do not want to do is to present to your friends in the audience who know more about it than you do. So I hope they will be kind to me when we get to the discussion at the end. Are we finally at a tipping point regarding a global recognition that urban issues are important? For over 40 years, my research program has worked to try and get urban issues taken seriously. But for the first time, we seem to have this recognition. You can see this quote from the high-level panel set up by the United Nations Secretary General, looking at urban issues quite seriously for the first time. And as it said, the post-2015 agenda must be relevant for urban dwellers. Cities are where the battle for sustainable development will be won or lost. So in a sense, for the first time, in a very high-level panel within the UN, we finally have a recognition that urban areas are quite important, urban issues are quite important. And why are they unimportant? Why are they important? Well, 1 in 7 in the world's population lives in informal settlements such as these, around 1 billion people. That's 1 billion people living in very poor quality conditions. Most lack piped water, most lack sanitation, most lack drainage, most lack healthcare, emergency services, schools, even the rule of law. Even very often the right to vote, because in many nations, if you have an illegal address, you can't get on the voters' register. And if we look at the statistics for those informal settlements where there's been careful research, very high infant mortality rates, 20 times what they should be, very often 20 times what they are in that same city in a high-income area. Child mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, 20 to 50 to 100 times what they should be. Hunger. You know, these are people concentrated in the world's most successful cities, and yet half the population in many informal settlements is suffering from hunger. So as we try to reconcile climate change, disaster risk reduction, and development, so let's look at some of the overlaps between these different agendas. And of course, the first agenda is poverty reduction, the universal provision of basic services. I'm very pleased to see that in the post-2015 UN framework, a commitment to universal provision of basic services is back again, rather than the Millennium Development Goals, whose goals were very partial, reduced by half, reduced by 2/3. Now, I think we're moving back to a universal commitment to water, sanitation, and so on. Then there's the other key agendas, the disaster risk reduction agenda that has become so much better understood and so much more influential in the last 20 to 30 years. The climate change adaptation agenda, which we know is very important, but we don't know its scale and scope because we haven't yet got the knowledge to locate how risks will change in particular locations. And then the climate change mitigation agenda. Urban governments, urban residents, urban enterprises obviously have key roles in all 4 of these agendas. How do we make these 4 agendas work for the billion people living in informal settlements? But then what about those who are to come? If we look at the United Nations projections, almost all the growth in urban populations is going to be in low and middle income nations. So we've got 1 billion urban dwellers whose needs must be met. We have maybe 2 billion more urban dwellers by 2050. And if you look at it another way, let's look at the projected growth in global population, looking first at high-income nations, almost no increment. Urban population in lower middle-income nations, an enormous increment. Rural populations in lower middle-income nations, an actual decline. So how do we make these 4 agendas work for the billion who are in informal settlements now and the 2 billion urbanites who are to come in the next 30 to 40 years? Now, it should be easy in cities. Cities have within them a major comparative advantage, agglomeration economies, economies of scale, economies of proximity. And of course, these serve businesses, which is why businesses concentrate in cities. They move there because there are economies of scale, economies of proximity, a diverse labor market, good services, utilities, subcontractors, and of course consumers. But there's also agglomeration economies for the provision of infrastructure and services. It's much cheaper to provide piped water to each person's home in a relatively dense area. The same for sanitation, the same for drainage, the same for healthcare, the same for schools, the same for the rule of law. So why aren't we using what should be an enormous potential of cities to provide safe and healthy cities? But if you concentrate people, you concentrate industries, you concentrate their wastes, you concentrate road traffic, without good governance, they become incredibly dangerous places. There's some cities in Africa with life expectancies of about 40 years. That's the same as Manchester in 1851. So these are cities that haven't improved on Manchester in 1851 before any of the key reforms on water and sanitation or healthcare and so on had been implemented. I don't think I need to labour the point about reducing urban poverty. We know what it means. We know that you make use of the agglomeration economies for the universal provision of basic services. You work with 1 billion or so people living in informal settlements to devise solutions that work for them as well as for local government. You manage land and you manage land use so that in every city the supply of land for low-income housing begins to match the demand. There was a mayor in a small city in Ilo that watched the rapid growth of his city, and all he did was use municipal resources to buy land, plot it, and sell it at cost. No informal settlements in his city. And yet when I asked him, did he realize how innovative it was? He said, no, it was common sense. So local governments do have the capacity to increase the supply and reduce the cost of land so that people have an alternative to informal settlements. Of course, you need support from central government. But we're beginning to see strong examples that show that what we suggest can be done. You look at how strong local democracies in many Latin American nations have actually transformed the quality of life for low-income groups, where slum and squatter upgrading has become the norm. It's simply what a good municipality does, where the extension of piped water, sewers and drains, schools and healthcare now reaches a much wider range of informal settlements. And we've seen new models of community-driven upgrading, most dramatically, I think, in Thailand through the work of the national government agency, the Community Organizations Development Institute, which, by providing finance to low-income communities, allowing them to choose how to organize the upgrading, how to negotiate tenure from the landlord, has produced dramatic changes. I visited many places that have been upgraded by community-driven development in Thailand, and you honestly don't recognize them 2 years later. You go before and you go after, and you can't even recognize them. They become places that I would be delighted to live. And of course, most importantly for me in the last 15 to 20 years has been the growth of organizations that represent the urban poor, the representative organizations, the federations that those organizations form. In India, Mahila Milan, this amazing network of 750,000 savers organized in women-managed savings groups, the National Slum Dwellers Federation and all its measures to get a better deal for slum dwellers. The example in India having then driven similar formation of federations, National Slum Dweller Federations in South Africa, in Namibia, in Malawi, in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Uganda, in Ghana, in Philippines, in Cambodia, in Thailand. Amazingly, now, local government has a real partner to work with that represents the needs and priorities of low-income groups. And at the end of this talk, when I've thoroughly depressed you about everything else, I will leave you with 2 examples of where things have worked really well, where international funding and federations of slum and shack dwellers and local governments have worked together, I think showing us a new model. Of course, to get poverty reduction and universal provision of basic services, you need the urban poor to be organized. If they're not organized, they won't get the political reforms they need. And of course, you need, and I think this is especially relevant in India, you need responsive and supportive civil servants and politicians. One of my privileges coming to India every 6 months is to meet a truly outstanding range of senior civil servants that have really worked with the federations in remarkable ways. In water, in sanitation, in community policing. Sheila Patel, who founded Spark and is directing Spark, this NGO in Mumbai, made this comment, and I think it's absolutely right. The most powerful resource of any poor community is being organized, bringing its own ideas, its own resources, and its own strategies to the table. If we look at disaster risk reduction, what have we learned? Well, we've learned from some very innovative work in Latin America over the last 30 years, from this network called La Red, which is a network of cities and research institutions that have pioneered disaster risk reduction, identify beforehand who's at risk, and act before the next flood, the next storm, the next extreme weather event. What they've done is to show how very careful, locally rooted analyses of deaths and small floods and houses damaged collect together all that data, and it gives you a much richer picture of risk, and therefore a much richer picture of what you can act. Again, you try to bring all sectors into understanding their role. Every sector has a role in disaster risk reduction. It's not something that's concentrated just in an agency for disaster risk. And we've got some good examples in some Latin American nations, in the Philippines, where national legislation is beginning to understand and to support the importance of these strong local processes, strong community-driven processes too. And we have the examples in the cities that have been applying disaster risk reduction. We have the examples from the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, making cities resilient. A range of cities, 50 or 60, 70 cities who made serious commitments to disaster risk reduction and to following a framework devised by them and UNISDR. We got the other innovations, the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, when it was confronted with the enormous number of people homeless after the Asian tsunami. It did something incredibly simple. It allowed the inhabitants of this camp for displaced people to take over the management. Small disasters coincide. Climate change adaptation. Aro and my absolute nightmare as we tried to convince a skeptical IPCC fifth assessment of the importance of urban areas. I think through dogged determinedness that by the end of 3 years, they began to understand the importance of considering urban areas in disaster risk reduction and in climate change adaptation. And we know what's needed. You need strong local analyses of disaster risk that then extends to include climate change risks. Also to consider the climate change risks that aren't really disaster focused, the constraints on water, the slow onset disasters that don't necessarily fall under DRR. The shift to resilience thinking, adaptation implies that I know what I have to adapt. One of the difficulties with climate change, human-induced climate change, is it's producing changes at local level that we can't anticipate. So the idea is that you move to resilience, which is a way of giving you a capacity to cope with the uncertainty and the uncertain and the unusual, as well as what you predict through the more, where we know that disaster risk is going to increase because of climate change, and sea level rise being an obvious one. And we know that good climate change adaptation needs local government action. It needs a competence and a capacity of local governments to act. It needs coordination between climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and development. And we need to translate the scientific knowledge into influence. No politician is going to read the 1,400-page report that Aro and I have contributed to. They probably won't even read our urban chapter, which is about, 80 pages. They may read our executive summary, which is 2 pages. But what's so important now is having had 3 years consideration. This is, I think, what we know about climate change, what we've learned in the last 5 years. How do we translate that into something that every politician, every civil servant will read and take seriously? If we look at what's being done towards this, we got some fantastic examples of cities innovating. Durban is a city which is particularly interesting because the head of climate change in the city government was part of our IPCC urban chapter. And what she's done is to document in considerable detail her successes and her failures, her difficulties and her solutions. And so what we've got in Durban is a fascinating laboratory of a city committed to climate change adaptation, but where the development budget and the housing budget compete with the climate change adaptation budget. So we have a real example of a city trying to come to terms with climate change risks, but also prioritizing development. We got other interesting examples. If anyone wants these case studies that I'm mentioning, just email me and I will send them to you. We have a fascinating example in the city of Manizales that's been innovating on disaster risk reduction and environmental improvement for 20 years. And now it's slowly trying to see how does climate change what we have to do. The city of Rosario in Argentina, which has been very successful developmentally. Better incomes, fewer informal settlements, one of the best healthcare systems in the world, changing watersheds so disaster floods reduce. None of this done with climate change in mind, but now it's beginning to think, how can we build on this experience and make our city more resilient to climate change? And again, the key role of organized urban poor in this, and the key role of civil servants and politicians who are sympathetic to this approach. So we can look at, again, large overlaps between these three in what is needed to reduce risk in importance, and the importance of local citizen and civil society pressure and organization in all of them. If those that are most at risk are not organized, political systems will probably not deliver for them, even if they have the intention to do so. Now, the discussion that I'm part of, organized by the UNISDR over these next 2 days, we have to cope with the fact that the term resilience has been applied to everything. So, resilient profits, resilient extraction of surplus value from the workers, resilient homes, resilient dogs, resilient neighborhoods. And the crazy thing is, this is exactly the same as what happened to sustainable development. Sustainable development was a nice, simple concept, and then everyone appropriated the term to describe whatever they wanted to legitimate. And the same has happened with resilience. But in climate change adaptation, it is at least worth thinking about how you apply the term resilience. And it's clear that you can apply it to cities, to buildings, to infrastructure networks. You can look at the resilience of an infrastructure network to cope with extreme events. The redundancy in it to avoid loss if one part of the system goes down. Safe failure, all sorts of obvious concepts for infrastructure. We can look at the same for services. We can look at the same for ecosystem services. But that's a completely different consideration than looking at the resilience of low-income groups. My colleague, David Dodman, came back recently from Uganda, where he was talking to low-income groups that were part of the federation, the Homeless People's Federation in Uganda. And what gives resilience to low-income groups in Uganda? It's being part of those savings groups. It's having a large social network to draw on if times are difficult. It's the amazing borrowing and lending capacity of low-income groups in the organizations, in the federations they form, that reduce their resilience. So we can also look at resilience in relation to poverty reduction, and it means different things to resilience to infrastructure. Resilience to poverty reduction, access to savings, assets that you can protect when there's an extreme event, livelihoods that are relatively secure. These are completely different from, making pipes withstand larger velocities or volumes of water, but both are termed resilience. And then, of course, you have resilience applied to disaster risk reduction and resilience applied to climate change adaptation. I'm very proud to say that I am very resilient to climate change. And it's absolutely nothing to do with me. I live in a house that meets building standards. I have a house that has water piped into the home. I have connection to sewers. I have connection to storm and surface drains. My kids could go to the local school free. I have healthcare within walking distance, free. I did my back in 7 or 8 years ago and couldn't move, and emergency services were around to pick me up and take me to hospital and then delivered me home. All of this gives me tremendous resilience to external stresses and shocks. I have insurance for my house. I have insurance for all my possessions. So in a sense, you get resilience to external stresses and shocks, including extreme weather, and including much of what climate change is going to throw at my part of London, at least in the next 10 to 20 years. And it's a reminder of how, over time, political organization addressed risk. In Manchester in 1851, life expectancy was 45 years. Now life expectancy in Manchester is probably 80. What's achieved that? Strong political pressure from organized urban poor groups and a whole range of other groups to get the water, the sanitation, the drainage, the healthcare, the schools, the rule of law. All the things that I enjoy, basically delivered by political change in England and in London over the last 50 to 60 years. No, 100 to 120 years. And it also has produced the financial institutions and the competence to cope with increased risks as climate change increases those risks. So not only have I got resilience, I have the institutions and the financial systems that will help increase that resilience as the risks increase. If we move to climate change mitigation, we know what is needed. We need somehow to de-link economic success from high carbon economies. We know that you have to manage land use and transport together, otherwise you simply get an increasingly automobile-dependent city. We know the rich world has to lead. We have no right to demand that Bangalore reduces its greenhouse gas emissions, when I would guess that greenhouse gas emissions here per person are probably a fifth of London. Here is a tenth of most US cities. And here it is where the rich world has to lead. You cannot demand from India or from any other lower middle income nation rigorous climate change mitigation targets unless those targets have been accepted and implemented in high income nations. Of course, we have to de-link a high quality of life from high consumption. And well-governed cities provide many opportunities to do so. What's being done towards this? Well, you've got many city governments taking some steps. Many mayors have championed this. Surprisingly, in the United States, where there's this rabid hate of any possibility of human-induced climate change amongst the Republican Party, there's 800 mayors in the United States that have committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Certainly not led by national government, even an Obama government that was meant to be supportive of addressing climate change. We have more funding available for climate change mitigation. And we have a global network of cities that are innovating and experimenting in this. So, in regard to what has to be done, very little. In regard to learning what we have to do, a lot more. But this is what worries me. This is not a process driven by the organization of those who are most at risk, because climate change mitigation is around reducing risk in the future. We have good examples of what can be done, but they are the outliers, the exceptions. So there's not much overlap between the first three, poverty reduction, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation, and climate change mitigation. There's a few in the margins, reducing air pollution as a secondary effect of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But what's scary, and this is what the fifth assessment of the IPCC will show, is actually that's what the issue is. Because maybe now climate change mitigation doesn't seem an urgent priority. But if we don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions, if we don't reduce this trend to become that, 2060, 2070, 2080, 2090, risks will begin to grow and accumulate so fast that even cities with high adaptation will not be able to cope. So climate change mitigation is absolutely essential as a risk reduction strategy to stop dangerous climate change, which will, well, we anticipate to start happening in 2060, 2070, 2080. This is where the word transformation comes. We need adaptation that links fully with disaster risk reduction within a commitment to reducing emissions. And this is sometimes termed transformative adaptation, so that as you adapt, as you build resilience to risk, so you also look at where you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions or other measures that reduce human-induced climate change to reduce risk in the longer term. The other issue is that it always falls to local government to implement all these agendas, usually that national government dreams up and makes commitments to. And so, in the Millennium Development Goals, it wasn't the municipality of Bangalore or the municipal authority in Mumbai that went to New York and made commitments for water and for sanitation. It was the national government. And yet an awful lot of the Millennium Development Goals that the government of India committed India to depend on local governments for their achievement. And this is going to be the same for really all four agendas that I'm talking about. In the end, it'll be through local governments and civil society that these four agendas will be delivered. You have to have locally rooted sustainable development because you need to understand the constraints and the resources and the capacities and what is needed to enhance them. You need the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's fifth assessment, but then you need to marry it with local knowledge, local partnerships, local data, local negotiations, local citizen pressure. There was this lovely Taoist poem written in the 5th century BC, and which was advice to rulers. And the advice to rulers was, start with what you have, build on what you know. In a sense, that's a very good summary for combining the three agendas of risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and poverty reduction. But if we accept that local government has such a critical role in the achievement of many of these goals, and the achievement of the new set of goals that will come in 2015, it also means we need the data to show that. Now, the whole data system, the whole data collection system is biased towards national sample surveys. National sample surveys are absolutely useless at telling you where the problem is. You can't disaggregate national sample surveys to tell you what's happening in one particular ward in Bangalore or Mumbai. But if you're in the municipal authorities, that's what you want to know. You need to know down to each ward, provision for water, provision for sanitation, provision for schools, where there's disaster risk. And in a sense, we've got to shift the whole National Statistical Office focus from serving national government, serving federal government, serving state government, to serving local government. If local government are those that are going to address these four critical agendas, they need to be serviced by the data that allows them to do so. I don't quite understand how local government is so marginalized in discussions of government and governance. Discussion of governance became very fashionable in Europe about 10, 12 years ago, but it was always national governance. It was never local governance. It was never, the governance level that actually is important to you for getting your home and getting water and getting sanitation and getting drainage and getting your kids into school. And of course, it isn't up to local government to fund everything. A critical part of it is putting the framework in so that private investment and household investment work with the four agendas. And with the right framework, you can do exactly that in land use changes, in infrastructure, in land use regulations. In many of the countries where I go with the federations, reducing minimum plot sizes, for instance, has been absolutely transformatory because it's suddenly made plot sizes affordable to a large part of the low-income population. Get the regulatory framework right, and it brings all the individual investment and the household investment and the private investment into an alignment with the four critical agendas. Of course, it has to be accountable locally, otherwise you get these terrible fantasies. This is most prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa, where if you go and look at city plans, for city after city, they're dreaming of creating Shanghai in Uganda, in Rwanda, in Tanzania, in Nigeria. And of course, Shanghai was transformed, but it was also the fastest growing economy in the world for 25 years. Somehow, in the bid to achieve world city status, you have to have accountability to local populations that kind of stop you having these incredibly expensive fantasies of how you're going to make your city world class. And of course, you have to have multi-level governance. And where it works, we see this really well, where government frameworks for legislation, for funding, actually support local capacity, local innovation, local capacity to actually take on these four agendas. I hope you can see this. This is one of my more scary graphs. What this is showing is the expenditure per capita in local government converted to US dollars at the same purchasing power. And what you can see at one end is what happens in high-income nations. Between $2,000 and $14,000 is available per person to local government, between $2,000 and $14,000. Now, these are all the cities that already have the pipe water and the sewers and the drains and the healthcare, so they haven't got a huge backlog. At the other end, you have governments where local authorities have a $1 per person per year or $2 per person per year. And of course, this coincides very much with the local governments that have these huge backlogs in infrastructure and services. So, these local governments could make the most fantastic commitments and the most fantastic plans. Who's going to fund them? And at the moment, there's very little funding available to fund them, especially funding the backlog in infrastructure and services. We can certainly learn from the innovators. I think certain iconic cities have been very influential. The city of Curitiba, which was one of the first to have bus rapid transit, promoted itself very successfully. It had a mayor who was a clever politician. And the example in Curitiba then influenced the example in Bogota, and now there's 150 cities where bus rapid transit is now operating. So it took one or two cities to innovate for others then to understand the relevance for their particular city. We need to innovate hugely in disaster risk reduction, in climate change adaptation, in climate change mitigation, and use these very strong examples to learn and to ask whether what they did couldn't be applied in other places. We have to find ways of delinking a high quality of life from high greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. If I was given the choice between Atlanta and Barcelona to live in and to work in, I would choose Barcelona every time. Barcelona has 1/10 of the transport greenhouse gas emissions per person of Atlanta. So it's a reminder that a very high quality of life can be sustained in cities without necessarily having, at least in the transport system, very high greenhouse gas emissions. And here's a table which I'm not sure whether it was David Dobman or I produced this. We kind of pinch each other's slides the whole time. And this is just showing you the dramatic difference in cities in greenhouse gas emissions per person. These are measured in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And Rotterdam, nearly 30. Actually, I better look this so I can see. Look how high Denver and Sydney are, both 20 tons per person per year of carbon dioxide equivalent. Washington, D.C., just under 20. Even Shanghai at 15. London at 6. Oslo at about 6. Porto Alegre at 2. Sao Paulo at 2. Kolkata at 2. Surat at 2. Dhaka at less than 1. And Kathmandu almost negligible. This is a slightly dodgy calculation, but I think I can justify it. If we wanted to stop dangerous climate change, globally, we need an average of only around 2 tons per person per year. So we can see Porto Alegre. Porto Alegre is one of the nicest cities in Brazil, fantastic quality of life, wonderful food, a strong local culture, very well preserved rural areas around it. Strong social commitment of its government over many years. One of the best recycling schemes I know, where the recyclers weren't having to go through people's bins, but the recyclables were collected and put in a depot that the city authority built for them. And yet it has below what is needed as a world average for greenhouse gas emissions. So we have cities with very high quality of life that at least are beginning to get below the 2 tons per person per year in the terms of Porto Alegre 1. Now, it's a little bit of a cheat because Brazil has fantastic hydropower resources, and that means that that isn't counted in the greenhouse gas emissions because there's no net emission. So part of it is luck, but part of it is also more compact cities, more well-run cities, cities with good public transport systems that can begin to de-link a high quality of life from high greenhouse gas emissions. We need to learn from those who are most at risk. Again, we go back to the billion dwellers in informal settlements and learn from them, learn from their networks, learn from their capacities. We know that low-income communities can do amazing things, but we also know they can't build trunk infrastructure. So our long-term friend and colleague Arif Hassan, who works in Pakistan on low-cost sanitation, has made this very interesting distinction. He's shown that communities, lanes, in the informal settlements in Karachi can put in the pipes themselves. And so if the government put the big pipes in and the communities get the small pipes, and you join the two together, and it enormously reduces the cost of providing good quality pipe water, sewers and drains. It's a clever amalgamation of what local government can do and what communities can do. And they deliver a cost per house, which is a fifth of the cost that the municipality previously estimated for doing this work. It suddenly brings good quality water supply, sewers, and drains into what low-income groups can afford. We need to change some of the acronyms. The consultative group on international agricultural research was an important network. In the early 70s, it was recognized that rural development and agricultural development were not producing the gains that they'd hoped for. So this network of prestigious research institutions was set up. And whether or not you agree or disagree with their recommendations, this was a massive effort to get research of relevance to increasing food production and reducing hunger. In urban, there's never been any support for this sort of thing. Urban research institutions have had to struggle getting money from a range of resources. Yet, in many ways, we have a bigger agenda now than the agricultural and rural research community had in 1971. But I think that it needs to take a different form. The consultative group on international agricultural research was big research institutions in 13 or 14 locations. I think what we need is an enormous network of existing research institutions that begin to collaborate with all the actors, with low-income groups, with community organizations, with local governments, to drive a new agenda that brings all those four elements together. So we could call it the consultative network on, I've forgotten what I was, it's terrible, you invent these acronyms and then you can't remember what they mean. The consultative network on climate and sustainable development. We need a network with the capacity to push the IPCC's fifth assessment. The IPCC fifth assessment comes out. What we then need is a campaign, global campaign, every urban researcher, every urban research institution, every practitioner looking at how this should alter their approach. We need local voices and insights. So at the moment, in the least developed nations, it's the national adaptation plans that are being developed. We need local adaptation plans. We need city adaptation plans. The focus shouldn't be on the nation. The focus should be on the local. And for years, I've been recommending to UNFCCC to change its acronym because the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I want to change it to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for countries, cities, communities, and citizens, which makes a hell of a mouthful of C's. But just to remind them every day that it's the citizens and the communities and the cities that they should be delivering for, as well as for the countries. And so you begin to look at all these key international networks that I hope will help us drive this change. And of course, the federations of slum and shack dwellers and the other representative organizations of the urban poor are a very key part of this. There's federations now in 30 nations, 16,000 savings groups. Then we have the networks of local governments, United Cities and Local Governments, which formally represents local governments within the United Nations, ICPLI, C40, the big cities that are committed to climate change mitigation. The network of international agencies, including Cities Alliance and UN Habitat. And then the networks of researchers and who bring in the science. And again, it's not replacing or competing with existing networks, it's bringing them together to make more coherent their combined approach. And of course, we need to get the framework of support from national governments, how NAPs deliver CAPs and LAPs. And we need to make sure that this whole framework for driving these four agendas brings in the private sector and private capital. These are actually, I think this is probably repeats points I've already made. But if we look at the post-2015 agenda, which is going to dictate what international agencies prioritize from 2015, probably for at least 10 to 15 years, where are local governments? Why are local governments never consulted in making the commitments and then agreeing to monitor their achievements? Where's the financial framework for local action? There's big money being planned for climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation, but with no interface with city or local governments. Because I get thoroughly depressed at this point, I'm going to leave you with two small stories which I think have enormous implications for how we should do a post-2015 agenda. For those of you that are interested, there's a longer version of this on TEDx. I did a TEDx talk on this in July. And the TEDx talk was wonderful because I was allowed to be rude to Bill Gates and the World Bank all at the same time. Not that he heard. But okay, think of these federations of slum dwellers, federations of shack dwellers, 16,000 savings groups. There's 300 homeless women who formed a savings group in Harare. They negotiated land on which they could build houses for all of them from the local government. They needed $18,000, and they wanted it as a loan. No international agency would support them. These are among the poorest groups in one of the most catastrophically dysfunctional national governments, at least. And all they needed was $18,000. And the whole international aid and development assistance business is not set up to talk to them. But the whole of international aid is legitimated on the basis of these people's needs and priorities. So my institute, which is a policy research institute, was approached in 2001 by a trust that we hadn't heard of at that point, the Sigrid Rising Trust. And they asked us, would you run a fund that rewarded community leaders? And we thought about that and thought, that's a bit odd. That's very divisive. You go into a community and you choose a community leader and you give them some money. How's that going to drive change? So we asked them, would it be possible for us to use this in a different way? We contacted the federations and said, look, we have the possibility of funding. Can we think of a way of using it better? And they said, yes, put the money into an account. We will meet. We will bring our proposals. We will then choose amongst ourselves which proposal gets funded. They get funded for that. And so, to cut a long story short, we spent the money in 6 months, all determined by the federations, and asked for some more, and got some more, and got some more, and got some more. And so, over a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, it's 2008. We got funding which was at the disposal of the federations of slum dwellers, the federations of shack dwellers. So the savings group in Harare got their $18,000 from this. Now what was slightly unfortunate is I happened to be in Harare at the time when they got the news that they got the $18,000. And I was with them in the site that they were going to develop. And they thought that I'd given them the money myself. And I got sung songs of praise for an hour. And if you've ever heard the harmonies that Zimbabwean women can achieve, it was absolutely gorgeous. I got 5 offers of marriage. And slightly embarrassingly, they're keeping one small plot right at the edge for my retirement. But just to go back, the quality of the houses that they built, they managed to mobilize the funding to build the houses once they got the land. And if you go to this community now, you see a strong, well-functioning community with good housing, with basic infrastructure, housing 300 homeless women and their families, housing about 2,000 people for $18,000. And they're paying back the $18,000. There's no point in paying it in currency, they're paying it back in building materials. And it won't be the full $18,000. But it just gives you a sense of how much these representative organizations of the urban poor, usually dominated by women, can do with limited funds, and how they match the limited funds with leveraging resources locally. Bill and Melinda Gates got to hear, well, the foundation of Bill and Melinda Gates got to hear of this and provided $15 million for this. And of course, this enormously expanded the scale and the scope of what could be achieved. And there's been over 100 initiatives in an enormous range of countries. And what the federations do is they will choose to do an initiative to demonstrate to local government what they're capable of. So for instance, the women in Malawi managed to negotiate land, built 200 houses, and then brought all the politicians and the civil servants to see it. And when they see the competence and the capacity of these federations, of course it changes the way they begin to view them. They're no longer women who are a nuisance waiting in their office trying to get their attention. They're women that can build houses cheaper, quicker, and better than the contractors that they normally use. And that's a story that has, I could tell for 10 or 15 or 20 different nations. The second is a slightly different methodology, the Asian Coalition for Community Action. What this does is it makes up to $3,000 available to any community organization that wants to try some collective investment. And, you know, the amazing thing is that $3,000, which is very little for me, goes such a long way when it's in the hands of low-income groups and their community organizations. Because it may not be much, but it's their money. And they can choose how to use it. And they can choose how to get money back. Many use it as a loan to get money back to help other communities. They also have what they call big funds. These are up to $60,000. This is where all the communities in a city who are getting $3,000 or $2,000 or $1,000 link together with the city government, and they agree to work together. At that point, slightly more money is available to them. And so the small funds and the big funds lead to citywide processes where local governments come to see the 7, 8, 9, or 10 innovations in any city. And it's amazing what they build. This is an all-weather walkway linking an informal settlement to the main city that was built for less than $1,100. It was actually cost more than that, but what they did, the women used this to leverage contributions from local shopkeepers, a small contribution from the local government. This is Davao in the Philippines, and a dangerous seafront erosion. This is before, and this is after. $750. And they're even committed to collecting money from those that benefit from this to return the $750 so that another community a little bit further up the coast can do the same thing. These are flags that aren't where projects were supported. They're flags in cities where projects were supported. So in each of these flags, there's maybe 5, 10, or 15 community initiatives that are being funded. You know, if an external funder goes in and funds one small community initiative, no one notices. They go in and fund 10 or 15. Everyone notices. And Google Scholar failed to find at least 10 of the communities that were actually mentioned in this. So this is an undercount. Okay, I'm going to end. We have an Urban Poor Fund International serving 16,000 savings groups that's already built or improved 200,000 homes, that's built toilet and washing facilities for around 1 million people, that has got strong partnerships with over 100 cities. We have the Asian Coalition for Community Action with 1,000 community initiatives in 168 cities. Again, 100+ cities where there's real partnerships between the community organizations and the local governments, even to the point where there's funds that are jointly set up and jointly managed. So the savings groups are trusting part of their money in city funds that is jointly managed by them and by the city authorities. Both of these are responding to the needs and priorities of low-income groups. Both of these are extending their reach upwards to get city government to support it, combining resources. I dream if just 1% of funding was spent on this, around $1 billion, how many cities will we transform the kind of bottom-up, risk-reducing, climate change adapting, poverty-reducing dynamic? And yet, none of the international agencies really want to support this kind of process. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation withdrew funding from this. I don't think they ever had a clue the innovation they'd funded and the scale of what they'd achieved with their limited funding. There's a little more information on these if you want it. You're very welcome to email me if you want more. One of the roles of my research program has been to document all these innovations. So thank you for your attention.